Many of us already know the scenario. You run the survey, participation is strong, the data comes back, engagement is down. Trust in leadership needs work. Manager effectiveness is an area of focus. So you do what you have always done, action plans, workshops, a new communication cadence, maybe a values refresh, and 12 months later, the same survey tells you the same thing. The same people are disengaged, the same pattern persists, the same problems come back wearing slightly different names. We know that. At what point do we stop and ask, what if the survey is only showing us the symptoms? What if the actual causes, the environmental forces shaping how your people behave every day, are something we have never measured and never looked for? My guest today has spent years answering that question. Dustin Snyder is the founder of Way Forward Associates and the author of Sink or Swim, the Human Systems Theory Approach to Business Performance. Love the title.
Thank
He
you.
has deployed his diagnostic methodology across nearly every industry in the United States, from family businesses to Fortune 500 divisions. And what he has found is that challenges are what most organizations understand in their workforce. Your people aren't disengaged because they lack motivation. They are not leaving because they are disloyal. They are swimming against currents they cannot name, forces that make their work harder than it needs to be, their contribution less value than they should be, and their future less clear than they need it to be. And no engagement survey in the world is designed to find. Today, we are talking about the differences between measuring symptoms and diagnosing causes, what those invisible forces actually look like inside a corporate environment, and what changes when you finally stop asking, how do people feel, and start asking, why do people behave the way they do? Dustin, welcome to the Growth Hacking Culture Podcast. It's lovely to have a topic that really passionates me because I also got that feeling and I cannot explain it. Certain culture surveys are not awesome and nobody reads them and they don't give you the truth. And that's a problem, right?
Yeah, it certainly is. Well, I'm very glad to be here, Yvonne.
Awesome. So you write that employee behavior is something that is very rational, that
Mhm.
people respond sensibly to the conditions around them. That's a statement that is going to make a lot of leaders uncomfortable because it means the problem isn't their people, is what they have built around their people. How do you get a leadership team to accept that? It's tough, that one.
It is. And I don't try to convince a leadership team of it so much as I sit down as an operator who made this exact mistake at scale. I was in their shoes as the president of a manufacturing company with a workforce that just wouldn't buy into change. It was a real problem. It had real stakes. And so coming from someone who's been in their chair and got it wrong, but experienced the change, that lands for leadership teams. And then the data itself, it finishes the job. When you put a map in front of a leadership team that connects the dots for them, it helps them begin to see the design problem and the systems connections. And the one thing that I want them to feel is that this is good news. If your problems are people problems, then you are spending all your time forever trying to discipline and rehire your way out. If they're systems problems, then you built them, which means you can change them. And that is the most leverage a leader will ever have.
What I find quite interesting is that when we want to change the systems, I mean, most organizations have used these famous change management models, and some of them have 30, 40 years. Back then, we didn't believe about what is the impact on the mental health, on the well-being of the employees, on intrinsic motivation of employees. We didn't believe that it had really an impact. And suddenly we are still using these ADCARs, 7Cs or 6Cs, 7S, whatever it is from these people with nice haircuts and big bills. Tell me, how do we get around? So we have surveys that don't tell us root causes, and we have models to change behaviors. Let's expect that they are too old to work, right?
So they're certainly two different things, but they, as I think you're drawing the right connection, they should be related. I'm a big fan of, for instance, like John Kotter's model for change. What I think it has trouble with, especially in the past few decades, is that the order of things is incorrect. It places buy-in in the middle of the process after the change has already been designed. And the way that I've discovered things actually work is that you need to achieve that buy-in before you set out on the course for change.
So another thing that is quite interesting is that if we look at the engagement surveys industry, man, there is so much money out of that. There is Gallup, there is Qualtrics, Culture. Every major organization runs one, and you are saying that they measure symptoms, not causes. That's a big slap into their faces. That's a direct challenge to how most companies understand their workforces. Uh, do they have that is wrong? That you feel that it doesn't connect with the reality?
Sure. I don't think it's a slap in the face to the survey companies themselves. I think companies are not using them correctly because surveys aren't worthless. They are good at the thing that they're built for. They're good at taking the temperature, benchmarking you against an industry, telling you if anything moved. If engagement dropped, a survey can tell you that. I think I want to be fair about that. But the limit is it's more structural. A survey is a confirmation tool. So you decide ahead of time what matters. You ask people to rate those things. And so it can only return answers to questions that leadership already knows to ask. And the real driver of your employee turnover, for instance, might be the way that shift schedules collide or an approval process that needs 3 signatures before anybody can decide anything. It might be a really frustrating problem that 3 different departments have a hand in. And those don't appear in the survey because we don't know about them yet. And then with surveys, like 2 things follow after that. So first you get a number with really no mechanism behind it. You hear, okay, trust is low in the plan. Okay, why is it low? Between who? Caused by what? The survey can't really say, so leadership is just running blind, trying to do trust related things. And then second, and I think this is the one that tends to freak out executives a little bit more, is that people answer surveys strategically. So when your experience has taught you that raising a real concern might get you labeled a problem, you're not going to put that concern on a form. You're going to give the safe answer and keep your head down. So surveys measure what people are willing to share, and so they rarely reach what people actually live in their day to day. So that gap between the score and the cause is the entire reason that I built SWIM, the Strategic Workforce Insight Mapping process. In fact, many organizations have hired way forward after their engagement survey just left them with more questions than answers.
I totally feel you there. It's almost like having a doctor who will just put the fingers where it's painful and how painful is it? But nobody will go and understand from where does the pain come from.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you're talking about the lack of context. So we know that there is a problem, that we already feel it, that most leaders already know about it. Well, and then they pay a fortune for a survey that will confirm what they already feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what was missing is the context, as you said, because this story about saying from 0 to 1 or 0 to 10, sorry, how big is your pain?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't give you context. Now, because of the idea in the ideal world, we would have interviews and we will have a discussion and try to understand what is the context behind. But that's not really feasible financially, like having an interview with every single person in a company. Now with AI, that is possible. Are we saying that AI can contextualize? Are you using that, in fact? Are you using AI in order to contextualize the from where it comes from?
I'm not using AI for that yet. So we are using AI on the back end for the analytics, but the front end that engages with the workforces of our clients is still entirely human. In fact, I'm still taking handwritten notes for things, and I do that because While you're right, an AI engine would be able to have a conversation with every single employee in an organization at the same time. The trouble is that that does not address that issue that I raised a moment ago, where if someone feels nervous about engaging with a survey tool, at their workstation, at their computer, online, using AI to have more of a conversational approach isn't going to change that. I've found that while people tend to trust their own personal AI accounts, perhaps more than we should, they still don't tend to trust the enterprise level accounts of their organizations. They recognize that those are tied to them, and whatever they do interacting with that agent, they are is going to be documented. So I don't think the trust is there yet. And there's also a lot of types of organizations and industries where a good portion of the workforce does not have their own workstation. There's people that work with their hands. There's people that work, out in the field. There's a significant portion of the economy that is not sitting at a desk like you or I might on a given day.
That's true. So you mentioned that you have developed something called a strategic workforce insight mapping, SWIM. In simple terms, what does SWIM diagnose that traditional engagement survey completely misses?
Yes. So a survey tells you how people feel. And actually, I think your analogy of, can you rate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10 is the perfect analogy for an engagement survey. I have not used that one personally, so I'm stealing that. I think that's great. But you're right, it doesn't give you any context. So a survey tells you how people feel, and swim tells you why they feel that, and it traces it back to specific conditions that you can actually change. So the whole swim methodology is built to answer this one very deceptively simple question, which is, what is it like to be an employee here? And you follow a person's real experience down to the conditions creating it. And what comes out is a map of interconnected variables and the behaviors that they're driving. So it shows what communications pathways work and which ones don't. Why they're broken, what breaks them. It shows why people are leaving, and the fact that it is almost never money. It shows where your own structure is working against the outcomes that you want and generating the exact problems that are keeping you up at night. So where a survey hands you a score, swim hands you the wiring diagram behind the score.
It's almost like, so instead of asking about the pain, so you are talking about the experience that the person is having, the processes that enables this person to make their job and fulfill their, let's call it, destiny as an employee. And so the processes and systems that are interacting with their day to day, because we are, as you say, interconnected. It's not about the individual as such who comes with just a couple of beliefs, thoughts,
Hmm.
feelings. But no, this guy is affected by triggers, and these triggers are external.
Yes.
And you are assessing this interaction.
Hmm.
Nice. That's a good one. So you use a powerful metaphor in the book. Employees are swimming against currents they cannot name, exhausting themselves against forces that feel permanent but are not. Tell me a little bit more about that. What are these invisible currents in a typical corporate environment? What have you seen most often in your work?
It's funny because I can't take credit for the swim metaphor. For the first few years of using this process, it had a different name, a much worse name, and I recognized that the name was not ideal. And I went back to a number of client CEOs and said, "Hey, you guys have benefited from this process, many times over, but I recognized that the name didn't really capture what it's doing." And so I asked them to give me input on how to rename it. And the workforce insight mapping came from one of those CEOs, and many of the other ones used the word strategic. So when I bolted those together and got the swim metaphor, all those other water metaphors started to just click. So that metaphor about the currents, comes from something very true about swimming in water. And a current is essentially an invisible thing. You can't see it. You can only really feel it pulling. And So if you don't know it's there, then if you're watching someone swim, you assume that the exhaustion that that person's experiencing, the fact that they're not getting where they should be going, is the fault of the swimmer, that they're not strong enough, or they're not committed enough, or they have poor technique, or they're just not cut out for being a swimmer. And that's exactly the thing that happens to good people in a organization that's not designed intentionally. So the currents are that environmental thing. They're the things that we in management built without meaning to. The important property of every one of those currents is that they feel permanent to the people that are swimming against them. And they're not. They were designed in by us as leaders, which means that they can be designed out. But first, somebody has to be able to spot them and point them out and name them.
I was thinking that, and that's an idea. I might be completely wrong. That there was two different type of people. People who likes being compliant. So if you give them like no matters what process, even with a lot of friction, they will take it, even if it doesn't make sense, because they're paid to spend time on the job, not to achieve something. It's just to
Hmm.
spend time. So they will take it. And there are people who are maybe a little bit more creative or like challenging the status quo, that where the frictions are going to be painful. Voila, exactly. Are going to be painful. So, but do you see these two type of people that maybe for some of the people in the company it would be good to have these frictions, but for some others it might not be good?
I think that what we want is a phrase that I use often. It's how do we make the right thing the easy thing? If we want people to behave in a certain way and we want a certain, behavioral outcome at scale from our workforce, and people have friction in the way of doing that thing, we are going to get a lot less of that behavior in our organization. So we want to design the environment and the processes, the tools, the information, the feedback, we want to design everything around someone to take the handcuffs off and make it very easy for them to perform and behave in the way that we would like. If if when you're driving your car, if there was something, in between you and the steering wheel, you would probably go back to that car company and say, "Hey, it's really hard to turn my car when I need to turn my car. Can you move this thing, get it out of the way?" And it sounds silly, like why would you put something between you and the steering wheel? Then you can't use it. But that's genuinely what we do when we're building organizations, because we rarely design them in an intentional way. As we're growing, as we're scaling, we're focused on the customer, we're focused on the outcome. We're not really looking at the things between, A and Z. So a lot of time what I find is it might not even be designed intentionally. We don't even realize that there's something in between us and the steering wheel, or something between the drivers of our cars and the steering wheel, so to speak. It just happened to land there at some point. And because we are at a different vantage point as leaders, we're sitting in a very different place than our frontline employees are. We didn't even notice that thing land there. And so one of the things that I stress very often with my clients is that this might be a very, very simple fix that we just can't see because we're sitting in the boardroom. We're not doing the thing.
It is a little bit painful sometimes that certain processes are there, and they create a lot of friction, and they are there because somebody at the top put it there. And then to try to convince that person at the top, who sometimes is the CEO, put something like a process in order that, I don't know, you have less losses, or because people are not sure how to do things and they might be mistakes. And all this produces friction, pains, mental pains to the employees. How do you go about to convince this person that if you remove that process, nothing is going to get worse?
I connect the dots for them. I'm able to see what they can't, because they're not spending time at the front line, and they should not. They should be focused on the market, the strategy, the customers, not how the sausage gets made. That's not the seat a CEO should be sitting in. If they're in the day to day, then they're not able to engage in their best and highest work. But what swim does for an organization is it makes that previously invisible process that the front line might be dealing with very visible to leadership, and it maps the behaviors. So just like an engineer might look at a mechanical process and say, okay, we're getting this outcome that we don't want out of this machine. Why is this happening? And we go back and look at, oh, this thing is broken or this thing is moving in a way that it should not be. And that's, the first domino. So I'm able to map that for them. And I use the phrase connect the dots often to show them exactly the cause and effect chain of events that results in the behavior. And when I do that, I do it in a way that allows them to put themselves in the other person's shoes and say, okay, if you were in a situation and X, Y, and Z were happening, how do you think you would react? And they tend to say, oh, okay, I can see why people are doing that. That seems like a rational behavior. So when you show them that, this is not just a character flaw, they didn't hire 20% bad apples in their workforce. They're not incompetent in that way. They're hiring normal people who meet the qualifications, who have experience doing the thing, and most of the outcomes are okay. But when you're able to show them that there's a cause and effect here, and that people are behaving rationally, then they're able to put themselves in their shoes.
You have deployed this swim approach across nearly every industry in the United States. And I would like to understand, do you have an example? Don't mention a company, or if you won't mention it, it's even funnier, where the survey, this culture survey said one thing, but the system diagnosis revealed something completely different.
Hmm.
What did you find?
I have a lot of examples. I'll pick a simple one for so I don't no one's eyes glaze over while I'm giving context. So there was a healthcare network that I worked with, and they got a really low score in their communication category on their engagement survey a couple years in a row. And the chief operating officer brought me in because he was just kind of at his wit's end about it. He didn't understand. He was telling me about all of this communication they do. And they made a lot of efforts to increase communication between a couple of the surveys, and they had actually gotten worse. So he's describing these town halls, the bulletin boards, the emails, the newsletters, their texting platform, their company intranet, like you name it, they're doing it. And so communication was the impetus for them reaching out. And there were other things going on that they needed help with. So the swim diagnostic found a lot more valuable information for that leadership team to act on. But on this communication topic with the engagement survey itself, the findings were really interesting. We found that the workforce was actually scoring communication so low on the survey because there was actually too much of it. They were overwhelmed. They were just drowning in communication. There was so much across so many channels that they actually couldn't find the information they needed and wanted because it was just all becoming noise. So the fix wasn't more communication, which is what they'd been trying to do. It was actually getting a lot more intentional about it and deciding on specific channels for specific types of information so that people would know exactly where to go for which type of information. And when they made that change, their score was almost perfect on the next survey. And I learned a lot from that myself. It made me look at communication a lot differently in future clients and helped me to start to see patterns that I can help leadership teams with anecdotes like that.
Dustin, I look at you and I'm thinking, this guy is not the typical psychologist. So he has a mix of engineering, he has a mix of ex-CEO or current CEO, sorry, and human resources. You are a mix of everything. You cannot define by yourself by something that you studied. I mean, your experience have already reshaped you completely. Is that correct?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I pull from everywhere, and you see the same conclusions reached by, at least in my experience, like almost 20 different fields of science. They're all reaching this conclusion that human behavior is actually rational, and it's a hard science. It's predictable in the way that we're used to biology and chemistry being. And those fields just aren't talking to each other, and they're certainly not talking to the MBAs. But that's where we're at. In the literature truly supports that human behavior in groups at scale, whether it's a family system, an organizational system, is a predictable thing.
And the amazing thing is that maybe 15 years ago, if you try, like, I'm not a psychologist, but I tried to read books about human psychology. It was much more difficult 15 years ago than it is today, because today is almost like, even when there is scientific approach, like sometimes neuroscience have a background with it, there is analytics, biology, and so on. To understand it has become a little bit more accessible to people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pity, in fact, that now that it's accessible, CEOs are still not taking that book that maybe have an impact in their organization, or that HR person who was once upon a time a psychologist and in 15 years has become an admin assistant, or a perfect expert in Excel, doesn't take back a little bit of this human psychology to
Mm-hmm.
have more impact in the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just not something that the human resources field gets training in.
Mm.
And that's something that Way Forward is intending to work on changing. That's part of our longer term strategy, is to really open this up to the HR field.
Yeah, that would be great. I had a feeling when I was reading your book about that your book draws a lot on clinical psychology, system science, and decades of this workforce intervention. If you could get one concept from each of those fields in the mind of this same CEO that I was talking about, what could be the three concepts that you want him to have inside of his head in order to have the impact and the type of organization that maybe he dreams about, but he feels incapable of making it happen?
Okay. Yeah, that's a stellar question. So from clinical psychology, especially a lot of Murray Bowen's family systems work, the central concept is that you can't understand a person's behavior separately from the system that they are a part of. So in a family, we know that the child acting out is usually carrying the anxiety of the whole household. It's the same in a company. So the employee who looks like your problem is, and we call them problem children in management. We know this. They're usually carrying, they're the place where the system stress is surfacing. So, every CEO has that problem person that they're fixated on. And I want them to ask what the system is routing through that person, because I could give them from my own experience and then from a dozen instances of my clients where that problem employee very quickly became the most engaged employee who was actually leading the change when the system got corrected. So from system science itself, I think the biggest thing is the fact that systems defend their own equilibrium. And I'll say that again, like, systems defend their own equilibrium. I've seen a lot of organizations that, had these change initiatives or these behavioral or values initiatives, and they just fizzle out. A lot of fanfare in the beginning, and then they just fade. So your organization is producing exactly the behavior that it is built to produce, and it will fight to keep producing it. And that second half, I think, is the part that people don't tend to be ready for. It's why those new initiatives fade. You launch the new program, everybody's nodding along, they go to the trainings, and 6 months later, the place looks identical because the structure underneath never moved, and it quietly absorbed your initiative, because people's brains are telling them that they need to in order to survive, they need to behave this way. Their behavior is an adaptation to their environment. It's a survival adaptation. So they believe that they will not be successful in the organization if they change their behavior. You're telling them to fight their own brain. So if you want different behavior, you have to change the environmental structure that's generating the current behavior. And then you asked about my own experience. So 15 years in labor relations and the years I spent running a manufacturing company, I'd say you can't fire your way out of dysfunction. You can't train your way out. You can't hire your way out. Organizations can cycle through people for years. They're disciplining the symptoms, they're replacing people, and you mentioned this earlier, they're getting identical behavior from the people that they've replaced people with, in a very short span of time. So when the new hire becomes the old problem, we have to recognize that people stopped being the variable a long time ago. And the constant is the conditions that they walked into. And I think all three of those things point to what Jeff Bezos figured out a long time ago and has influenced, I think, a lot of Amazon's dominance in the market back in 2016. So 10 years ago now, he said that when the data and the anecdotes disagree, the anecdotes are usually right.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Something that has struck me from what you just said is this idea of equilibrium. I translated it in my head as organizational inertia, which I mean, the individual has it because for us it's very difficult to change certain behaviors, like how I interact with my teenage daughter. I cannot change it, or I think I cannot, or it takes me time.
Hmm.
And organization as being accumulation of the individuals with their environment together. So there will always be this inertia, like this inertia that allows that a weight cannot be pulled just in an easy manner unless it's rounded. Yeah, that strikes me that it is not considered enough when there is these ideas of change management. It looks so smooth. It looks so easy. You engage with them. You have a buy-in. You have communication over and over. But this inertia exists and is never treated in this change management
Hmm.
models. I have a
Yeah.
last question, Dustin.
Sure.
For a leader who just realized that they have been treating symptoms for years, and sometimes, as you said, investing already in the wrong thing for years and years, and they feel like shifting. What is the most important move that this person should be doing in order to shift from this vision of looking at the symptoms to looking at the root causes, the systematic that you have put in place
Hmm.
behind your model? What this person should be doing, like the next step, like tomorrow, other
Yeah.
than calling you, of course. That's another
Yeah.
thing.
So what I hear from my clients is like, I can't unsee the system now.
Hmm?
But the instinct, like the second you see it, your instinct is to go fix everything. And so I would say resist that. You've just learned that your interventions have been landing on symptoms for years. So the worst thing you can do now is to start, just swinging at the system blind, because you'll change things without knowing what they're wired to. And a system, as we've talked about, will punish that. It will try to find its own equilibrium. It will have unintended consequences. So I think the first move is a lot quieter and harder to do. It's to just change the questions that you're asking. So for years, for leaders, it tends to be, why won't these people perform? And you got to kind of retire that reflex. The question I would replace it with is, what conditions would make high performance the rational choice for anyone standing in this role? Or maybe a bit simpler, what I said earlier, what would make the right thing the easy thing? So that little shift puts your attention where the leverage actually is in the environment that you control around the people. And then I think all I would say is, go out and find out what it's actually like to work in your organization from the people living in it. And you got to show with your actions that you're the type of person who the truth is actually safe and useful to share with. But you'll hear things that are going to contradict your dashboard, and you have to sit with that. So I wrote that book, Sink or Swim, to take a leader from that very first moment all the way through. But if you've already felt that shift, that's where you start, is just before you touch a single thing, just change the types of questions that you're asking.
That is true. Dustin, I feel safe enough to ask you a crazy question.
Sure.
So, I don't know if you're familiar that in physics there is this, I don't know if you call it theorem or experiment of Schrodinger experiment, that
Mm-hmm.
the fact of measuring something will affect the outcomes. That,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that there was an analogy with a cat, the Schrodinger cat, and all the stuff. That's something that I was just thinking now. Isn't there a better way to ask questions on an organization without asking them? That you can avoid influencing the outcome. It looks a little bit philosophical, but are we going to get there once? Because as you
Yeah.
say, we feel terrified. What if this information is shared? So how can we onboard, create the trust from the beginning that it's not a measure?
Mm-hmm.
And that measure shouldn't be changing my behavior or what I say, in fact, that I do, and in fact, I don't do.
Yeah. So the effect that you're describing, exists in organizational psychology also. Actually, one of the very first documented industrial organizational psychology experiments was in the 1920s at a place called the Hawthorne Electric Plant. And so now it's called the Hawthorne Effect. And what the researchers there were doing is they were trying to see what changes to the environment would influence worker productivity positively. And so they, true to the scientific method, they were changing one variable at a time, and they increased the lighting in the plant, and productivity went up. And then they decreased the lighting in the plant, and productivity went up. And they kept, we thought the lighting helped, and now less lighting is helping. So what they realize is exactly what you're describing, is that just the fact that you're paying attention and you're making an effort, making changes, is going to have a positive impact on people because you're paying attention to them. So to avoid that, the worst thing that can happen in the swim methodology is that we influence the things that people are saying to us, that we influence the data that we're getting, and it compromises the reliability and validity of the map that we're creating for the organization, for the leadership. And so we use techniques from psychodynamics. It's not clinical therapy. I'm not a clinician, but it uses the same techniques, and it avoids steering the conversation. It avoids steering what employees are going to share with us, or the topics that they're sharing, and but it helps to pull out those thoughts and feelings and beliefs and memories and metaphors and such that people have for their work environment, and their experience, and their reasoning behind their behavior, that they wouldn't necessarily be able to share with us otherwise if we didn't use those techniques. But on the surface, it looks like very open-ended interviewing, essentially. So we're avoiding the thing that the surveys have trouble with, which is, survey by its nature is a list of questions that you have decided on topics that you have decided on. And so what I don't want to do is decide what's important ahead of time. There's a famous example in the US from UPS, is a shipping company, where they had their best employee engagement survey results in the history of the company. And a few months later, they had a company-wide strike because they hadn't asked about the things that were most important to the workforce. They missed those topics. I don't know if that was intentional or unintentional that they didn't put those things on the survey. But when when you make assumptions about the topics that you're going to engage on, you potentially miss things, or you steer all the data in that direction, and you lose out on really the root causes that swim gets at.
Dustin, tell me, if people have questions about the swim methodology, other than reaching out and buying the book Sink or Swim, how can they reach you out? What is the best way, the easiest way to get to you without any friction?
Sure. The simplest place is wayforward.work. It's the firm's website. If somebody wants the full thinking behind all this, the book is Sink or Swim. It's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Audible, Apple Books. I'm easy to reach on LinkedIn, just Dustin Snyder. And then honestly, if something landed today for someone and they're looking at their own team wondering about it, they're welcome to send me a message, because those conversations are my favorite part of this work.
Thank you very much, Dustin. It was really nice. And I could feel in the way you communicate your science is that you are very eclectic. So that this diversity of minds sitting in your head. In fact, the way it makes it easy also to understand. If you were purely a psychologist, I wouldn't get everything. Thank you very much. It was lovely to spend time with you.
You're very welcome, Ivan. This was so much fun. Thanks for having me.